In 1847, a German chemist invented a way to turn meat into sludge. Black, viscous sludge, so devoid of any nutrition that it killed the animals who ate it. But god damn was it delicious. So delicious, in fact, that it changed the entire world. Well, it sure as hell changed Uruguay. One of the most important names lost to history is that of Justus von Liebig. You've probably not heard of him. Don't be ashamed of that. I hadn't heard of him either, and I do this for a living. But Justus, he was famous, proper famous. Not a celebrity, but like changed your life type famous. There are few people in all human history who have been nearly as influential as him, half as influential as him. They call this guy the father of organic chemistry, and that sounds like a big deal, but even that is selling him so short of what he actually was. In the 1800s, his name was legally public license because everybody knew what he meant. And as well they should have. He is one of the major reasons that you exist today, that they existed in their time. No matter where you are on Earth, hell, if you live in much of Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, Peru, or Bolivia today, you can basically thank him directly for kickstarting your economy. Because although he invented a great many other things, including the basis for Marmite, yeah, Australia, think about that, he had two major discoveries that changed everything. In 1840, he proposed that nitrogen would make a good fertilizer, which was a huge deal. Nitrogen that would eventually be found naturally occurring both off the coast and under the sands of the Atacama Desert, then controlled by Bolivia and Peru, but soon taken by Chile in their own quest for glory. In turn, all three of those fledgling nations would essentially found the basis of their economies on the guano and nitrates that they dig out of there. But for Uruguay, Argentina, and regions of southern Brazil, it was an entirely different discovery from Justus that would lead to their rise. Specifically what he called the extract of meat. Essentially, it's a method whereby 30 pounds of cow can be squeezed into a pound of sludge, or I guess chemically turned into a pound of sludge. This black, delicious, but most importantly, non-perishable sludge. Somewhat comparable to molasses, or so I read anyway. I can't say myself. I never tried it, but that is what they said at the time. Originally, it was sold in pharmacies as meat tea. You boil some water and pop in some meat. You drink it with a meal. Sounds a bit ridiculous, I suppose, but these were really scant times, and meat tea made surviving on cabbage soup feel at least a little bit better. And that was enough to make it famous. Unfortunately, it also turned out to be completely innutritious. They never really admitted that, but independent research found that it killed dogs who were fed exclusive diets of it, so it wasn't like people didn't know, they just loved it anyway. They loved it because, by God, above everything else, it was tasty. Guilty pleasure tasty, maybe, but it did flavor up that water pretty nice, and these were rough times. You gotta get your meat where you can. Originally, that sludge sold in those pharmacies for around $100 a pound, 2020 US terms, which is a hefty price, I presume. I don't actually know. I didn't dig all that deep into the economics of the sludge. But given that it didn't take off at that time, I can presume that at the very least, it wasn't cheap enough. It still definitely held some value over meat, otherwise they probably wouldn't have continued making it. It just wasn't to the point that it found its purpose yet. It wasn't what von Liebig wanted. Because like most geniuses, von Liebig was a bit better at inventing than commerce. And for the extract to become what it would eventually be, what we know it as today, it required someone with a completely new set of skills. So 15 years after it was first concocted in that laboratory in Germany, a young railway engineer named George Giebert would bring a sludge factory to Uruguay. And in those vast pasture lands of South America, he found the key to achieving von Liebig's goal. The pampas of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay are some of the largest uninterrupted grasslands in the Americas, a place that since the extermination of its original peoples has been turned over almost exclusively to cattle. In the mid-19th century Uruguay, cows outnumbered citizens by an obscene margin. Even today, the ratio is over 3-1. To paraphrase hip-hop, this is a place where the cash cow is actually beef. But in the 1860s, despite beef being among the most expensive meats on the European plate, that value didn't quite extend across the Atlantic. There was probably nowhere on Earth at that time you could get a steak cheaper than rural Uruguay. The markets of Europe were just too far away for it to be profitable, and the local population wasn't nearly large enough to demand the supply. For the most part, they tossed the meat and just sold the hides. Thousands of pounds of dead meat just rotting. That is, until von Liebig. On the banks of the Uruguay River, their new sludge factory was born and immediately began dealing with all those corpses. With the economy of scale now on their side, it did exactly what Guibert promised it would do, and soon the extract was being produced at a third of the original cost. Within a decade, they'd be making 500 tons of it a year. That's 30 million pounds of meat, 65,000 cows. However you want to divide it, it's a lot. And that factory soon became a de facto town within a town. And before long, the company would sport a professional football team, a hospital, and a school. And despite how famous it became and how many people would know of it around the world, today we mostly remember Liebig's Extract of Meat Company for its second product, and eventually its second brand name. After advancements in the 1860s dropped canning time for meals from hours to minutes, in 1873 the factory started pumping out their first tins of the corned beef that they're still known for today. Branded after the town that surrounded the factory, Fray Bentos corned beef quickly became a staple of British life. Even presumed pedophile Prince Andrew claims he grew up on it, although he's not exactly shown himself to be entirely truthful. It's no accident that these products became famous foremost in Britain, despite being started by Germans, because Uruguay was treated by London sort of like a nation to safely invest capital. The factory at Fray Bentos was just one example of that. Their gunboat diplomacy meant that neither Argentina nor Brazil would ever truly feel safe in trying to conquer this tiny country, just so long as Britain said not to. And in turn, they could invest here relatively securely, without ever having to, officially colonize anybody. And as a reward, the cattle raised in those lands would feed Britain for generations. Sort of an example state for the way America would eventually conduct its imperialism. And it's hard to overstate just how important this factory was to the entire world, not to mention the outstripped effect it had on Uruguay. 1 out of every 200 people in this country worked here. Translated to an American-sized population, that would be 1.5 million jobs, twice the size of Amazon's current staff, all in one factory. But unlike Amazon, they actually treated their workers well. They had to. They had to inspire people to move all the way to Uruguay in South America. They had to provide a standard of life for working class people that would be otherwise impossible to achieve almost anywhere else on the planet. And that had a profound effect on the local system. It introduced labor rights and immigration laws. It built up logistical networks. It built up roads. It built up the international image of this country. It kickstarted Uruguay's economy beyond what it had ever achieved up until that point. It was the most important single factor in the nation at that time. But on top of everything else, it fed the world's wars for 100 years straight. Soldiers fighting in the American Civil War ate von Liebig's meat molasses. Canadians fighting the Boers ate Fray Bentos tin beef. Some of the first tanks ever used in war were nicknamed for these tins because they were that ubiquitous. In 1943 alone, the factory provided 16 million cans of corned beef to the Allied war effort. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that without this factory, Britain would have had a really tough time winning those wars. And because of that, it remains a household brand in Britain today. You can still pop down to the corner shop and pick up a tin. They seem pretty generically gross to me, so I'm not sure why you do that, but they are still around. And nearly 150 years after they started, you can still get some Fray Bentos beef in a can. That's longevity. With the sands of time, some things have changed, though, and it no longer comes from that original factory. They closed that down in the 60s and moved everything over to the UK. Today, that factory is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the only ones in the country, and yet nobody really visits. Because it's a factory. It's not an easy story to tell. It's not an easy story to see. The history of the world is simply easier to make interesting when you're talking about bullets rather than beef. And perhaps that's why we don't remember von Liebig today. Because he never shot anybody. He just fed people. This is Rare Earth.
Office boy. I mean, I wish I had office boy button in my home. Boy! I don't even need anything. I just wanted to call you boy.